Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Pacific Bridge Medical's webcast on Japan medical device regulatory updates and recent revisions. Questions can be submitted during the presentation via the chat function on your screen. They will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation. Here is Ames Gross, President of Pacific Bridge Medical.
Yeah, hi, this is Ames Gross at Pacific Bridge Medical. I think as most people on the line know, we're a consulting company helping medical device companies in the Asian and Japanese marketplace. So if we switch over to slide 2 here, you can see the topics that we're going to cover. And the first part of the webcast, we're going to talk about just some general registration issues in Japan. And then toward the end of the presentation, we're going to get into more of some of the new regulations and how they may affect you in the Japanese marketplace. So I think most people on the phone or on the webcast today have been to Japan. Japan geographically is the same size as the state of California, but of course in Japan we have 4 times the population as the state of California. California I think is about 30 million people, and in Japan we have about 120 million people. And keep in mind too that Japan is the second largest medical device market in the world. The size should be somewhere between $26 and $27 billion, and that's still significantly higher than the size of the medical device webcast in China, where I see all kinds of numbers about the China medical device size, but probably in my mind, the medical device market in China is around 12 billion, or maybe half of the size of the Japanese market. But of course, the question then is how to get into Japan and how to prosper in the large marketplace there. Now, it's possible for you, your company people in Japan, or your representative in Japan, or your distributor in Japan, to have a pre-consultation meeting with the PMDA on what your regulatory strategy should be, things that are going to come up, etc. So, generally during this pre-consultation meeting, the PMDA will not go over the detailed information or comment on the information you give them, but they may give you some general advice about the application procedures, and they may also recommend that you go to a more formal consultative session. So this pre-consultation meeting is free, and oftentimes the pre-consultation session is not needed. But over the last few years, there's been over 600 pre-consultation meetings with the PMDA. So in the past, you could have consultation meetings with the PMDA in Japan, let's say 4 or 5 years ago, but the meetings really didn't give you any results that you could bank on. But things have changed, and they set up these official now consultative sessions, as you can see on the next chart. So if you're not sure how your product will be classified, or whether, let's say, clinical trials are required for registration, that's when you want to maybe take advantage of the PMDA consultation meetings. And more companies are using these Japanese consultative meetings to get more details on the regulatory strategy in Japan. And what you can get out of the feedback of these consultation meetings is some bankable information to help you to develop your Japan regulatory strategy. Now, keep in mind that to attend these consultation meetings, there's a fee that you have to pay the government, and also you need to prepare almost 2/3 of the Japanese dossier for the PMDA to review before they can give us some strong feedback about what may happen with your device in the Japanese market. So to attend one of these consultation meetings, you must prepare, let's say, 2/3 of your dossier for Japan, and so that'll take some time. And as I mentioned again, the PMDA consultative sessions, there's a fee to the government. Normally it's between like $8,000 and $20,000. Now, I picked out a couple consultation sessions just to talk about a little more detail. Obviously, the most common issue, or maybe the most important issue if you're trying to get your device onto the Japanese marketplace, is whether local Japanese clinical trials will be required for registration in Japan or not. So in the past, companies would use foreign clinical data, oftentimes to get Class 3 products registered, let's say. So obviously, if you have to do clinical studies in Japan, you're looking at maybe between 12 and 15 months to do the study, and the clinical study in Japan may cost anywhere from $500,000 to several $1 million. So it's really a key issue for companies, especially with risky devices, determining how to enter the Japanese marketplace. Okay, so basically on the clinical evaluation session is, can you use foreign data? And so is the clinical data obtained outside of Japan sufficient to be attachment for the product registration application? Is the non-clinical data adequate to validate the safety and efficacy of the product? And is additional clinical data required? So this is another one of the consultation sessions with the PMDA now, and this again is a consultation on the design, the number of cases, et cetera, for your clinical trial in Japan, if it's determined that a clinical trial in Japan is required to get your device registered there. And during this clinical trial consultation, things like the target patients, the disease, what's the size of the trial, how many cases, is there going to be comparative testing required, what will be the endpoints, and is the statistical method appropriate that you're going to use for the clinical trial for the Japanese PMDA submission. So we're going to switch now over to device classification, and so you can see some information here. So basically, the terms that are used in the ISO 14971 and their definitions are used in the GHTF guidance document. And the JMDM, the nomenclature there, is over 4,000 codes, which was created in 2004. And basically, Japan was trying to globalize and internationally harmonize with the old nomenclature and types of medical devices before that. And then during 2004, obviously, the classes were introduced, classes 1 to 4. Obviously, that's different than in Europe or U.S., where it's maybe classes 1 to 3. And new medical devices are evaluated on their efficacy and safety, et cetera. So keep in mind also that when you have a Class 2 product in the U.S., it may be a Class 3 product in Japan, or you have a Class 3 product in the U.S., it may be a Class 4 product in Japan. So this next few charts actually outlines the different types of classifications for medical devices in Japan. I think most people are familiar with the Class 1, 2, 3 definitions for general, controlled, specially controlled products, and I think it's fairly self-explanatory there. Now, to market the medical devices in Japan, obviously, you need to have a market authorization holder or an MAH. And the MAH must register the devices through the following procedures. And so, for example, on the Class 2 products in the past have been split into whether they're a Ninsho or PMDA approval. So some Class 2 products you could get approved by a notified body in Japan, and some Class 2 products you would need to get PMDA certification in Japan, or PMDA approval in Japan. And obviously the difference if you're going for a Ninsho versus a PMDA registration for a Class 2 product is going to be the time to get the products registered, et cetera. But according to the new revisions of the PMDA, by the end of 2014, more certifications will be accepted for Class 2 and some Class 3 products. So that means that most Class 2 products, or almost all the Class 2 products, and some of the Class 3 products will receive certification from a third party and not need to go through the PMDA. So the next few pages gives a further breakdown on whether the product, which class the product it is in, and if the product meets certain standards or clinical data is required, et cetera. Here you can see for improved medical devices, So the categories for medical devices that do not have an applicable approval standard or do not meet the requirements of the approval standard, and some other requirements too. So oftentimes what we have is people call us up and they say, we have a Class 2 product in the U.S. and we want to know what the classification is in Japan. Now, let's say the Class 2 product in the U.S. is also a Class 2 product in Japan, but we have to keep in mind that there are a variety of Class 2 registrations in Japan, and that's what the next few slides cover. So on the Me Too here, the first one, the GCP clinical trial data is not needed to prove safety and efficacy, but in the application documents for the Me Too category here, substantial equivalence to the predicate device in Japan must be clearly shown. Or Me Too medical devices, clinical trial data is not required, and the compliant with the approval standards you can see. And again, here, GCP clinical trial data is not needed to prove the safety and efficacy. Now we're going to go through some of the basic points on product registration. For some people, it'll be very common and familiar, but for others, it should be somewhat informative. So this is the typical flow chart for the approval at the PMDA. Obviously, the applicant on number one is going to submit the application. There's going to be a document review at the PMDA, oftentimes outside experts in that specific disease or medical sector will be consulted. There's a reliability inspection, which is done by the Office of Conformity and Audit. They do GLP, GCP, etc. And there's the Office of the Compliance and Standards, which looks at the QMS situation. Then on number three here, you can see number three is the reliability check. Number four is the QMS, whether it's going to be on-site or document. Number five is the approval. And then number six, there's the periodic QMS conformity assessment inspection. And this is done normally during the renewal of the business license. So as I just mentioned before, third-party certification will be expanded under the new PAL, which will come into effect toward the end of 2014. So the number of notified bodies will increase to around 15 notified bodies in Japan. About half of those will be global and half will be domestic Japanese notified bodies. So right now, of Class 2 products, third-party certification for, let's say, Class 2 product is in place now for about 1,300 of 1,800 Japanese medical device nomenclatures. So right now you have about 3/4 of Class 2 products in Japan getting a Ninsho approval, not a PMDA. But Class 2 products, all Class 2 products will, in the future, after at the end of 2014, will require a Ninsho through a third party and not a Shonin PMDA. Of course, this is going to depend on the risk. And obviously, the certification is easier with third-party certification than having to go to the PMDA. So in the future, there's going to be more certifications for third parties for Class 2 medical devices with medium risk. And in the future, some Class 3 products will undergo certification by third parties too, once the certification standards have been developed. This will then allow the PMDA to focus more on higher risk Class 3 and Class 4 products or new medical devices, and to reduce the device lag on the approval process. So more third parties will be involved with Class 2 and some Class 3 products, and the government is going to focus on more risky Class 3 and Class 4 products going forward, starting at the end of the year. But in addition to that, the PMDA is going to increase the supervision of third parties, such as doing yearly audits for notified bodies. And more QMS data will be required to be reported to the PMDA. And of course, they're going to check further the quality of the auditors at the third parties and the reviewers. They're going to increase the supervision of the third parties through yearly audits, and and the quality of the auditors and reviewers at the PMDA will also be assessed and further training provided to help with the PMD registration of some Class 3 products and Class 4 products. These are the basic requirements for the medical device application form. On the first category, medical device category, we are looking at the JMDN code and the Class 1, 2, 3, or 4. If a single product belongs to multiple categories, obviously you want to select the category of the medical device with the highest risk. I mean, actually, that's what the government's going to do. They're going to look at the single product which has the most risk. Intended use and efficacy, obviously the target patient population and the disease, usage conditions, anticipated effects. And so a checklist is available now on the PMDA website. It's only in Japanese for the application dossier requirements and all the required documents that are also required. So most of these items we're going to have in the next few pages, but there's a checklist in Japanese on the PMDA website for what has to be in the application dossier. So again, items described in each application. These are attachments and some details on the attachments. Again, information on attachments that are required for your approval in Japan. Now, so now in the next chart, basically, we're looking at attachments for new medical devices. So what attached documents need to be attached to the dossier for new medical devices? And you can see here, this is for primarily Class 4 and some Class 3 products and maybe even a couple Class 2 products. And the circles represent the attachment is required. The triangles, it's going to be determined by the individual medical devices. And on the X, the attachment is not required. So again, this is for new medical devices. Now, for improved medical devices, we have a similar group of attachments, and again, the same key, so you can see what information would need to be required for an improved medical device. And then on the next chart, we have the same kind of attachments, what will be needed for the application for Me-Too medical devices. And you can see there the application category, and then Class 4, 3, or 2 on the left side, and then the triangles and the X's representing what's required, what's individually driven, and what's not required. Now, I think most people are familiar on the line today with the STED, and STED is also part of the Japanese dossier. And obviously, there's a general overview of the product, the background of the origin and the discovery and the history of the development of the product, the status of the product, how it's used in foreign countries. And so I think most people understand what's on the STED, so we'll just quickly go through this slide and then the next slide, which also talks about requirements for the STED. So with regard to labeling, instructions for use, labels, the drafts, risk analysis, things like the system for implementing risk analysis, important hazards, etc. Now, the things to note are that you want to make sure that you get the correct JMDN code, whether it's Class 1 to Class 4, and and also keep in mind that the PMDA reviewers like to get as much detail as they can, as demonstrated in the previous slides. On the other hand, I think some companies put in too much detail, and especially on the quality assurance or QC, and this can lead to difficulties down the road. So you want to be very detailed, but not too detailed. Obviously, in Japan, the presentation is very important. Just like when you go to a Japanese restaurant, you see a picture of the food in the window, and everything, the quality and the exactness is very important. So you want to review all the information included in the application, the STED, very carefully before the submission, and make sure that the documents are very high quality. Obviously you don't want to have typos or model differences or name changes which we see pretty frequently in registering Japanese devices in the Japanese market. And, of course, you want to make sure that the clinical trial results are in line with your indications in the application documents. And also what you want to keep in mind is to search for similar review reports of any new medical devices to understand the current clinical trial study designs and trends in current thinking of the PMDA reviewers if clinical studies are required. And again, there are several English language review reports of medical devices that's available on the PMDA website, so it's always a good resource to take a look at things. Now, obviously, besides the dossier for product registration in Japan, you have the Foreign Manufacturer Accreditation. And the FMA is required to import foreign manufactured medical devices, drugs, or quasi-drugs in Japan, and foreign manufacturers must be accredited before acquiring the approval. And right now, the accreditation, the foreign manufacturing accreditation, is almost exclusively on document review, not on-site visit. And keep in mind that the packaging, labeling, and storage of medical devices is considered a manufacturing process in Japan. So, this is important because let's say if you have your own office in Japan acting as your MAH and storing your products, for example, and then you decide to switch to a new MAH who will store your products, a new FMA would be required. So there are some specific areas you want to be careful about switching MAHs with regard to foreign manufacturer accreditation. Okay, here we're looking at the FMA process. So basically, the new issue here is going to be that a Japanese MAH going forward who markets medical devices manufactured by a foreign manufacturer can now make an accreditation application on behalf of the manufacturer. So instead of the manufacturer doing the FMA itself. So again, in the new revisions, a Japanese MAH who markets the medical device manufactured by a foreign manufacturer can now make an accreditation application on their own instead of the manufacturer making the accreditation application. However, even with the MAH making the accreditation application for the FMA, the name of the applicant on the application form should still be the foreign manufacturer's name. And obviously, an applicant is responsible to renew their accreditation every 5 years because the FMA is valid for 5 years. And normally what the PMDA recommends is for renewal of the FMA, the document should be submitted 5 months before the expiration of that FMA. So here we're going through some information on the current system for the FMA, so this is the existing categories for FMA accreditation. And again, this is the current system. What documents will be reviewed for the foreign manufacturing accreditation, and this gives you a sense of what's required currently for the FMA. And you can see here, for example, on the facility building outline, obviously here you have to identify the manufacturing area, the inspection area, packaging and labeling areas, clean rooms, sterilization areas, and storage area for finished products. And but of course, you want to always try to keep this as vague as possible to camouflage intellectual property and key information. So here, this is basically with the FMA revision. So on the old system, you needed to submit the documents that are mentioned in the previous 2 slides to receive accreditation. But now under the new PAL, we'll have a simplified process. So what is going to happen is both the domestic and the foreign manufacturers are required to register with the PMDA, but they're not required to get an accreditation. So it's a different situation, registration now under the revised FMA revisions versus getting an accreditation, which has been the situation in the past until later this year. And there's not going to be any more categorization of licenses. So that's also an important fact. And there will be no inspection at the time of the registration in principle, because normally the manufacturing sites will be inspected during the QMS inspection if it's needed. And again, the materials required for the FMA registration with the new PAL will be significantly simplified, and not the materials required on the previous two slides for the current FMA requirements. Now, there's some changes in the QMS system too, which is a requirement for the product registration too. So basically, when a medical device manufacturer, let's say an MAH, applies for product registration in Japan, they'll normally be audited to ensure compliance with the Japanese QMS GMP. And whereas the FMA, let's see. So the additional requirements for the QMS will include things like the product standard code, the retention periods of documents and records, and infrastructure requirements. So this is all coming out of Ordinance 169 here. And obviously for the manufacturing facilities, the facilities that only do sterilization or storage will fall into this category as well. The contract design facilities manufacturing components will not be audited unless you're applying for a standalone component. Distribution center, they're going to be looking at packaging, labeling, or storage. So the QMS, whether it's going to be on-site or document review, has in the past revolved around a few things. And you can see in this chart what the risk of the product is, the manufacturing or process risk, and then the other risk, whether the manufacturer is one of the GHTF member countries, yes or no, and history of the past inspections. So, so I'd say 5 to 7 years ago, there were more and more on-site QMS audit inspections, but I think there'll be less in the future, except for the very most risky products. So this goes through some of the requirements on the QMS. The manufacturer needs to keep copies of all the key documents equivalent to the lifetime of the medical device. You can't keep the documents less than 2 years. Shelf life plus 1 year. You also need to keep some other records like training documents for 5 years, etc. So again, the QMS is the renewal period is every 5 years. Post-product approval inspection. And from April of 2012 to March of 2013, about 1 year, the PMDA did 89 QMS inspections. 35 of those inspections were overseas and 54 were domestically in Japan. So again, the on-site inspections not as many as they were in the past. But the revision on the QMS, the main revision here is that the QMS will now be done according to a product group instead of individual products. So this is a big difference, because if you had separate products and you had separate registrations, you may have to have separate individual QMSs for each of your products. But now, under the new revision of the PAL, the QMS will be done according to product group. The regulators, however, have not yet devised the product groups, which are still under discussion. And obviously, the key factors for the product groups will be things like the manufacturing process, risk of device. And the QMS can be done according to a product group as long as the product families are manufactured by the same establishment. And again, the QMS inspection will be applied to the MAH, not to each manufacturer. So if the plant is already approved, let's say for another device of the same risk and category, another QMS inspection might not be necessary when applying for a new device if it's in the same product grouping. So again, this is a big change from individual product QMS to product grouping of QMS. Now, the next few slides we're going to go over relatively quickly, but as we talked about before on the consultative session, the key question for most foreign manufacturers in Japan will be, can they use the overseas clinical data for product registration in Japan? And if they can't use the clinical data, they're going to have to do some bridging studies or local clinical trials in Japan, and obviously these could be quite expensive. So the next few slides talk about, can overseas clinical data be used in Japan? Most of them are fairly self-exploratory. So today, even some Class 4 medical device registrations may not need local clinical studies in Japan. But of course, it's going to depend on the product and the clinical study information that's already obtained from overseas. So in general, the GCP principles in Japan for medical devices which are equivalent to or better than the Japanese GCP, including things like ISO 14155, 2011, clinical investigation of medical devices for human subjects, and good clinical practice. So the main issue then is the result of the clinical study conducted outside of Japan, that it's not affected by an ethnic difference. Because oftentimes in Japan they'll say, okay, these products worked on, these clinical trials were based on Caucasians, African Americans, or whatever, but we're Japanese, we're ethnically different, and is that going to affect the usage of the clinical trial in Japan? So this chart basically gives you a sense of when overseas clinical data has been used for product registration in Japan, and it only goes up to 2012, but you can see here that in 2012, riskier products, 23 products were able to use foreign clinical data, and then 23 products required local clinical studies in Japan. So again, on the overseas data, keep in mind now that the Japanese J-GCP, or good clinical practice, and the U.S. GCP and ISO 14155, 2011 are essentially equivalent. So it's getting a little easier in some ways to get your overseas clinical data to be used because it's getting closer to Japanese GCP requirements. Again, can clinical trial data be used overseas? The principles that are set forth in ISO 14155 2011 also apply to other clinical investigations and should be followed as far as possible, depending on the nature of the clinical investigation and the requirements in each country. But also keep in mind that the ISO 14155 2011 does not apply to in vitro medical device products. And again, can overseas clinical data be used? Now, in the right corner here, in the Japanese GCP, only a physician, or let's say a dental doctor or a dentist, can be the principal investigator. So if you're doing clinical trials in the U.S., for example, you want to make sure that you get a principal investigator in Japan who's a doctor, or if it's a dental product, a dentist, to get on board with the trials that you're doing, in the United States or, let's say, Europe. And this goes through some more information about whether clinical data can be used in Japan. So then this next slide basically is talking about the reliability check. So the PMDA rarely conducts a GCP on-site inspection for clinical data. Normally, the PMDA was only going to do an on-site GCP inspection of the clinical data for very high-risk products, or let's say when the PMDA might find something suspicious about the documents that they've reviewed for conformity inspection. So normally the GCP requirements, again, done paper, not on-site. Now, of course, if you're doing the clinical trials and you want to use the clinical trials for Japan, or you have to do local clinical trials in Japan, you want to make sure you meet the Japanese J-GCP clinical trial requirements. So that's what the next few slides goes over. So it's basically the standard for conducting clinical trials for medical devices in Japan is the Japanese Good Clinical Practice, or J-GCP, for medical devices. These are the ordinances that led up to the Japanese GCP regulations. And on the bottom there, you can see the PFSB and the ONDE. And the PFSB is the Pharmaceutical and Food Safety Bureau, and the OMED is the Office of Medical Device Evaluation. So again, some more slides here on how to do clinical trials in Japan according to GCP standards. So I think a lot of this information is fairly self-explanatory, and there's different chapters on how to meet the Japanese GCP standards. So basically here you can see that we're talking about new medical devices, and this is an example of a sponsored clinical trial for an investigational new medical device. So prepare written operating procedures. So a person who intends to sponsor a clinical trial shall prepare written operating procedures for the duties related to sponsoring and managing the clinical trial, such as the protocol, selection of medical institutions, accountability, things like that. So again, these slides are going over Japanese GCP, and I think they're fairly self-explanatory. So we're going to go here to the summary. So again, keep in mind that Japanese GCP was updated in 2013 and followed by the ISO 14155-2011 and the GHTF. So now we're going to go to some other revisions or regulatory updates for the PAL. So basically what happened was the PAL revisions were passed by the Japanese Diet in November of 2013, and they will become effective within 1 year. So some of the changes we talked about for the FMA, the QMS, they're going to become effective as of November 2014. And the PMDA officials say that the revision bill to the PAL, was published in the Public Gazette on November 27th, 2013. So again, the revised PAL must be in place by late November in 2014. So here's some of the key changes. So medical device regulations revised on device characteristics. Tissue and cellular therapy product regulations introduced. We'll talk about that a little later. So the PAL includes a section on establishing a medical device MAH with separate requirements from the drug MAH requirements. So in the past, the MAH had certain requirements which could be fairly similar to drugs and devices. Now there's a separate section on what the device MAH requirements are going to be. And as I mentioned before, the new revision on the PAL expands the third-party review system to cover some highly controlled classified devices, and all Class 2 devices and some Class 3 products will be approved by notified bodies and not the PMDA. Now, another one of the revisions is regard to post-market surveillance, and instead of a re-examination system, they're going to implement an outcome examination system, which is going to look at the safety and efficacy of a device designated medical device will be examined for an appropriate period. So, for example, let's say an implantable medical device such as a stent would be one type of designated device that would be assessed for an outcome examination as opposed to a re-examination system, which is in place now. So under the current re-examination system, the PMS, or the post-marketing surveillance, is undertaken for all new medical devices. And the PMS guidance is the good practice system and programs for inspection and conformity assessment. So this change, again, from the post-market surveillance from a re-examination system to a outcome examination system will make PMS more feasible and reasonable for the PMDA, and it should increase the efficacy of the medical device regulations. Also, at November 2014 this year, the name of the PAL is going to change to something called the Act on Securing Quality, Efficacy, and Safety of Pharmaceuticals, Medical Devices, Regenerative and Cellular Therapies, products, gene therapy products, etc. So at the end of this year, the name of the PLA will change from PAL to the Act on Securing Quality, Efficiency, and Safety of Pharmaceuticals and Medical Devices. And the IVD registration changes are similar to the medical device regulation changes in the revised PAL. So a lot of the things that we talked about today on the QMS certification or notified body approval for all Class 2 products, some Class 3 products, will also be implemented for IVDs. Okay, on the next slide, new labeling requirements. So under the revised PAL, the package insert language for a Class 4 product must be filed with the MHLW in advance, as well as published online. So this is going to apply to companies selling, marketing medical devices, drugs, and regenerative medicines. And so a new medical device application must include a draft of the package insert to get the product approved. Now, there's some new revisions, too, with regard to medical software. So currently, only a combination of the software with the hardware is regulated in Japan. So if you have a CT machine and it has software embedded in it, then the product is regulated as a medical device, and the software is not regulated as a separate item. But this has made it difficult for some companies who have had software upgrades, as sometimes if you had a software upgrade under the current system, the entire device might then be required for a resubmittal and a new approval. So today, actually, the software not in a medical device is not regulated. So there's a lot of medical companies now coming out with standalone software products that could be used in a variety of CT machines or could be used in a variety of other products. And under the new PAL, the software, independent software will be regulated independently. So the software can be registered as a standalone product. And again, standalone diagnostic software will need to apply for pre-market product approval depending on the product's risk. And again, you either have notification, certification, or approval from the PMDA. So with the software being registered as a standalone product, you no longer have to get approval for the entire device, the software and the hardware, when there's just a software upgrade. So that should make things a lot easier for software. And we have a lot of companies that have contacted us about their medical software, and in the past they couldn't register it on its own merit in Japan, but going forward after November 2014, software companies will be able to register their standalone software with the PMDA, etc. And okay, let's go on to the next slide. So we have the new requirements on the draft labels for risky products on the previous slide, and then again, medical software being regulated as a standalone item for software. Now, there's also going to be a lot of new regulations for cellular and gene therapy. And actually, November 20th in 2013, not the exact same date as the new PAL revision, the Japanese Diet passed an act regarding the insurance of safety and regenerative medicine and the regenerative medicine law. So now medical institutions can now outsource processing cell cultures to companies that are not medical institutions subject to certain regulations. And the cellular and tissue therapeutic products will be categorized differently. So getting these products onto the market should be faster. So in the current system for these types of products, both the gene therapy products and the regenerative and cellular therapy products are categorized under the drug or medical device categories. So they're currently, let's say, in the medical device categories. But under the new system, both the gene therapy products, regenerative and cellular therapy products will be separate categories, have a separate categorization. And so, in Japan, you have categorization like drugs, quasi-drugs, cosmetics, medical devices, but there'll now be a fifth category just to deal with these products. And I think this is going to help to provide more appropriate regulations for cellular or tissue-type products, because we're not going to Japan is not going to just apply the typical drug or medical device regulations. They'll be more specific toward this specific product area. And, in the revised PAO, also in this area for cellular and gene therapy, it also includes measures that set standards for manufacturing sites for cellular and tissue therapeutic products to ensure the efficacy and safety too. So normally these products are made in a different kind of factory than a typical medical device factory, so there'll be new standards applied to those cellular and gene therapy type factories. So again, another significant change on the PAL. So here you can see some of the new regulations for the cellular and gene therapy. So on the top, you can see the current system with the 4 steps. And then in the new system for cellular and gene therapy products, the products are going to enter the market on a conditional basis prior to approval. And the efficacy is going to be monitored after the product is on the market. And then from there, the patients must receive informed consent for these specialized cellular and gene therapies. So you can see there'll be more steps involved with the clinical study and the approval process for cellular and gene therapy products. Now, another key change is an issue on raw materials. We've had some companies, in the past, they have a product registered in Japan, a device registered. They have a certain raw material registered there, and in fact, sometimes they don't even, if they change the raw material, they're supposed to notify the PMDA, but oftentimes they won't. So there are some changes now in the new revised PAL for raw materials. And the old system, if you change raw materials, you need to do a new registration oftentimes. But the notification in March 2013, if you can show the safety and the function of the raw materials is equivalent to the previous product, and the new material, either a different name or it says, let's say, has a different specification, the same name, if that raw material has a usage precedent in Japan and is already approved, then you only need to do a minor change notification. So no review is performed by the PMDA, and your MAH just informs the MHLW of the change in raw materials. So in the past, you would normally have to report this to the PMDA if the raw material supplier changed, but here you can just do a minor change notification instead of notifying the PMDA. So again, then if you can show that the raw material change in the foreign country, if the foreign country has an equivalent approval system, and that can be evaluated in terms of safety based on the history or adverse events or not having adverse events, and has lots of experience with the usage of the same raw material, and it's listed acceptable on the PMDA website, again, a minor change notification can be done. So the key issue would be on the raw material change, that the change of the raw material does not affect the performance or the function of the device. So otherwise, if it does, the raw material change does affect the performance and function. the MAH or your MAH in Japan must submit an approval application for the product change, and the PMDA will review this change, raw material change, and the MHLW will decide on the approval of the partial change application. But instead of a partial change application, which is more complex through the PMDA and MHLW, the new raw material changes will be through a minor change notification, not a partial change notification. And of course, if you're unsure whether the raw material is going to have to be done through a partial change application or a minor change application, you can always consult the PMDA. Now, some new future trends also, obviously in Japan, they're going to have, especially for risky products, more rigor with the post-marketing surveillance. And but of course, they want to maybe have more crucial devices or life-saving devices to be fast-tracked. But again, the revised PAL does not have any applicable specific revisions to expand the number of products eligible for fast-track approval. So there are some products that are getting fast-tracked now, but it's not clear how many or exactly when they'll get the approval. And in general, as the PMDA has been saying for many, many years, they are hoping to speed up the general regulatory process. And in 2004, for example, there were 22 regulators for devices, and then in 2013 there were 99 reviewers, so 4 times the amount of reviewers at the PMDA. And they're also looking now to reduce the time for registration. So, for example, brand new medical devices, in 2008 they might have taken, let's say, 21 months to get registered, and then in 2013 they were able to reduce it to around 13 or 14 months for registration. And then if you look at improved medical devices, let's say with the clinical data, currently it's about 60 months to get approval, and they're trying to reduce it to around 10 months going forward. So they're trying to add more reviewers and increase the review times as much as possible. Now, obviously, you don't want to go through device registration. You don't want to incorporate some of these revisions in your dossier, etc., if you don't know how the device will be reimbursed in Japan. Because if the device is not reimbursed in Japan, it's pretty much illegal to buy the product, except for in certain situations. So the key issue is when you're thinking about going to the Japanese market, registering a product or clinical trial is going to be required because that's a huge cost in Japan. And we went through some scenarios where foreign clinical data can be used and where it cannot be used. And of course, if you have to do clinical trials in Japan, you want to do it according to Japanese GCP standards. But a real important issue is the device reimbursement. And if the product's not reimbursed, it's not going to sell. And if the reimbursement amount isn't high enough, you may have some difficulties there getting higher reimbursement for your product, which you claim has new advantages. So quickly, we're just going to look at product reimbursement in Japan, and you can see there's different categories: A1, A2, B, C1, C2, and F. And basically, for A1 products, the reimbursement is included with the technical fee. For A2 products, the technical fee is granted for the use of the device or class of the device. And for the category B, these are Me Too products that are similar to other products in the market. So normally if a company comes out with a new function or new way to deal with a problem, your product is going to go into the reimbursement codes for C1 or C2. Almost no products go into the category of the F classification. So in the C1 products, your product is different than a Me Too product because it has a new function. And while their technical fees exist for the procedure, however, if the product has significant improvement versus prior technologies, so you can maybe go for a new function. And then in C2, the new products result in a new therapy or procedure. There's no predicate for the product or the treatment exists. you're going to have in the C2 products new functions and new technologies. So it just gives you a little information on how the product reimbursement works in Japan. Now, the product's reimbursements are revised every few years, and as you can see here on the top, the next revision is going to be in a couple months in 2014. Now, the price revisions are done according to two main areas. One is the reasonable zone, or the R zone, which is sort of a general revision method. And in the R zone situation, the reductions are based primarily upon the margins the distributors offer to the hospitals for products in a specific functional area. So the MHLW conducts a distributor pricing survey to assess the prices being charged to hospitals and the resulting margin as a percentage of the prevailing reimbursement rate. So that's the R zone situation for price revision. And then on the second thing is on the foreign average pricing, where up until now, the foreign average pricing reductions would occur if the reimbursement rate exceeds 1.5 times the foreign average pricing. And the foreign average pricing, I think it's U.S., Germany, France, England, and I think it's those four countries, but they're looking at the foreign average pricing. So, 10 or 15 years ago, a company may have 10% of their sales in Japan, but they may have 20% of their profitability in Japan because the reimbursement amounts in Japan were so high. But the Japanese government is now looking to reduce the reimbursements and will continue to do so in the future. So if we go to the next slide, we have an example of the first way to reduce the price on the R zone. And basically what's happening here is a reduction of the R zones is going to lead to lower prices. So you have a product here on the top where the reimbursement price is $2,500. You have the weighted selling price $2,000, the consumption tax, and then the selling price, and then you would add an R zone value to get the reimbursement for the product. But the reimbursement R zone has gone down from 10% to 8% and now to 4%, and so the reimbursement price is now, let's say, 2,184 yen versus what it was before at 2,500 yen. So obviously the new STM reimbursement price of 2,184 yen is less than the original STM reimbursement price of 2,500 yen. So one way to reduce the prices is to reduce the R zone, and you can see in this example it's down to 4%, and we don't know what's going to happen in a couple months with the R zone revision, but it's likely they might revise the R zone revision down from 4% maybe down to 3 or 2%. Now also on the next slide we're talking about foreign average pricing. So this is where the original price can't be more than 1.5 times the weighted average on the price survey of the four countries I just mentioned. So again, here the reference countries: USA, UK, France, Germany. Okay, and Australia was added in 2012, so there's 5 countries now. And the FAP, the foreign average price cuts, are calculated after the R zone adjustments. And so these two cuts, the R zone and the FA price reductions in price, are independent and not necessarily additive. So right now, if your product is selling overseas, if the product in Japan is selling for 2 times what the weighted average is overseas, the product has been reduced to 1.9 times the weighted average of the product overseas in Japan. And now the rumors are that for the foreign average pricing, that the FAP multiple instead of 1.5 is going to go down to 1.2, 1.3. So in other words, if your product reimbursement in Japan is 1.5 times what the weighted average is overseas, and now it's going to become 1.3 times what the weighted average is going to be overseas, there's going to be a reduction in the reimbursement price. So I think that covers quite a bit of information and mostly the comments on the new revisions. And obviously there's looking at new revisions on the reimbursement prices too. in a couple months in 2014. So now what I'd like to do is turn to the questions and answers. Okay, so just give me a minute here. Okay, so the first question is, do QMS approvals expire? Okay, so as I mentioned during the webcast, yes, the QMS approvals expire after 5 years, and normally the manufacturer must apply for the renewal 5 to 6 months before the expiration. The next question says, does an ISO certification reduce the profitability of an audit, the probability of an audit? Does an ISO certification reduce the probability of an does an ISO certification reduce the probability of an audit? So I'd say in general it doesn't. The ISO certification does not reduce the probability of an audit. However, I'd say that if you have an ISO 13485 certificate already, normally the auditors will devote more of their time and attention to, Japan-specific requirements, especially the Japan Device Master Record, or in Japanese, the Seihin Haijan Sho, which is the Device Master Record. Next question, how deep into the supply chain could the audit go? For example, could our suppliers be subject to audits too? How deep in the supply chain can the audit go? For example, could our suppliers be subject to an audit too? Well, normally the outside facilities that are going to be audited are going to be facilities for sterilization, testing, design, and development of the product. So I'd say in general your suppliers will not be subject to an audit, but the auditors will check your procedure and records to see how you decided on which suppliers and the records you have for the purchasing processes with different types of suppliers. Okay, so we have one person that says they couldn't hear the audio clearly, so we'll clear that up. And then we have another question here which says, will software carry a risk classification similar to the actual medical devices? So yes, software will have a risk classification when it's registered as a standalone product. Could you please clarify the impact of the new regulations on PMS? So as I think I mentioned during the presentation, they're going to have a situation for the PMS is going to be going from a re-examination system to an outcome examination system. So as I mentioned during the presentation, an implantable medical device such as a stent would be one type of designated device which would be assessed on an outcome basis as opposed to a re-examination basis. So, again, I mentioned that under the current re-examination system, the PMS is undertaken on all, the post-market surveillance is undertaken on all new medical devices. But in the future, for the new PMS, they're going to base it on an outcome examination, which will increase the efficacy of the medical device regulations in general. So that's as much detail as I have right now on the new PMS requirements. Okay, let's see, next question. When the new PAL becomes effective, what will happen to the software devices that are already on the market? Will they be required to obtain approval? Okay, so again, the question is, when the new PAL becomes effective, what will happen to the software devices that are already on the market? Will they be required to obtain approval? Well, I think if your software is currently in a device and the device is registered and reimbursed, I don't think anything will change. But if you want to register software which can be used in different companies' devices, or you have CAT scan software that can be used with different CAT scan manufacturers, then you probably want to register the software as a separate standalone software, and then have it applied to the different CAT scan manufacturers. So that's a good question. I think for the software, yes, it's going to have the different classifications like medical devices, and I think that for software that's in devices already approved, there won't be any changes, but if you want to register the software as a standalone product, companies will now be able to do that. So what we see is some medical companies are making healthcare software products. They could be anywhere from helping a hospital integrate their software systems to a standalone software for different types of applications. So in the past, they couldn't register the software independently, but in the future they can. And when the software becomes registered as a standalone item, of course it's going to be reimbursed as a standalone item too. Next question says, can a 510K clearance be used to demonstrate equivalency for a Me Too product? Yeah, I mean, basically in Japan, for a Class 2 product, a 510K can be used. But as I mentioned during the presentation, there in Japan are a number of subsets of Class 2 products. And, you have to check those subsets to make sure the 510K can be used. So the next question says, again, about software. Will standalone software already in the market prior to PAL implication be required to register by November? Well, again, I think that if your software is in a device, it's not going to necessarily be required to be registered separately. But I'm not sure that the regulations have come out on that. So I think the question is, if your software is already being used in a device and they come out with the registration of software as an independent product, will people that have software registered with the device have to register it separately? So I'm not exactly sure about that. So again, then we have another question about software, about how it's going to be reviewed. So the software is going to be classified, and then depending on the classification, then it will determine whether a PMDA or Ninsho approval will be required. Okay, we have a lot of other questions here, so let's try to go through those. What advice do you have for companies who feel the reimbursement process is not being done quickly enough or in the proper manner? Well, I think with regard to reimbursement, companies that feel like they're not getting what they need on the reimbursement, you can normally contact the economic division of the MHLW, where you can have some discussions with them and give more information about why you want to hire reimbursement or why you don't. So that's normally done through the economic division of the MHLW. Okay, so then the next question says, does the information used during consultative sessions need to be in Japanese? Must all documents be submitted in Japanese? Yeah, so if you're going to have a consultation with the government, all the documents need to be presented in Japanese. And as I mentioned before, you're going to need to do approximately 2/3 of the dossier that would be submitted to the Japanese government or for certification through Ninsho for the consultative session, and you have to translate that information into Japanese. Okay. Where can we get a listing of all existing medical device classifications in English? Where can we get a listing of all existing medical device classifications in English? I think, to my knowledge, the listing of medical device classifications is only in Japan currently, and it's not in English. Next question. Let's see here. Once the PAL revisions are in place, will the PMDA have an online seminar or webcast explaining the new regulations based on the PAL revisions? So once the PAL revisions are in place, is the PMDA going to have a seminar to discuss the PAL revisions? Well, I'd say in general, the PMDA does not have this type of training session for industry or manufacturers. But I know the PMDA does have training sessions for regulatories in other Asian countries. So I assume that PMDA will be dealing with the FDA and going through these new regulations with them. But I guess if enough people contact the PMDA asking for some sort of training session on the new revised regulations, they may try to run a workshop online or provide some answers in more detail in English on their site. Let's see, next question. When submitting a device approval application to the PMDA, you said the document review could sometimes include a consultation with outside experts. When does this happen? Well, the PMDA is going to ask the outside experts for their comments or suggestions to review the application documents when, let's say, a device is innovative or the PMDA, say, finds it difficult to determine the classification of the device, et cetera. So I think if it's a very innovative product or the PMDA is unsure about the product and the classification, that's when they're going to ask outside experts for their opinions and help. Okay, next question. How are IVD reagents classified in Japan, and what are some of the applicable rules? How are IVD reagents classified in Japan, and what are some of the applicable rules? Well, I know under the current PAL, IVD reagents are categorized as drugs, while IVD equipment is generally categorized as medical devices. So though the IVD reagents are categorized as drugs currently, they're normally controlled under some of the same regulations for medical devices, such as risk-based classification system, QMS, etc. So in Japan, there are three classes of IVD reagents, classes 1 to 3, similar to medical devices. And for IVDs, again, class 1 products require notification. Class 2 products, IVD products, require mostly third-party certification. And IVD reagents for class 3 products are normally reviewed by the PMDA. Let's see. The next question. Okay, I see some people had some problems with the phone connection, so we'll address that after the webcast today. Next question is, do you need to have an in-country representative in Japan? Do you need to have an in-country representative in Japan? So I think this is referring to foreign manufacturers that want to register their products in Japan. So if your company doesn't have an office in Japan or a rep office, subsidiary, or branch office, obviously for the registration you do need to have an in-country representative, and you're going to have to appoint an MAH or DMAH to liaison with the PMDA and manage your device registration. Now you want to make sure that the MAH or the DMAH is licensed to act as MAH or DMAH, and normally then they're going to be in charge of the registration process and getting the approvals. Okay, next question. What is the difference between an MAH and a DMAH in Japan? What is the difference between an MAH and a DMAH in Japan? This is a good question. So basically, the missions and the duties of an MAH and the DMAH are similar, but there are some differences. So both an MAH and a DMAH have responsibilities for good quality practice and good vigilance practice, GQP and GVP. However, there are also some differences. What the MAH in Japan controls the registration of the medical device. The MAH is the applicant and becomes the owner of the approval certification. So if it becomes necessary, let's say, to submit a supplemental application or transfer the application for approval certification, the MAH can submit these documents without needing the foreign manufacturer's approval. So again, the MAH is the applicant and becomes the owner of the approval. On the other hand, with the DMAH, the foreign manufacturer is the applicant, and the foreign manufacturer retains control of the device registration of the medical device, and the foreign manufacturer is the owner of the medical device approval and the certification. So the DMAH acts as a representative of the foreign manufacturer during and after the product registration. So again, with the MAH, the applicant is going to be the MAH in Japan. With the DMAH, the applicant is going to be the foreign manufacturer. Okay, we have some more questions. Let's see. When the standards such as GCP for medical devices, as defined in the laws and ordinances related to pharmaceutical affairs in the country or region where the clinical trials was conducted, differ from the Japanese GCP for medical devices, or even when no standards such as GCP for medical devices are stipulated in the Japanese GCP for medical devices, be acceptable. So a little confused in the question, but obviously, as I mentioned during the presentation, you want to do your clinical trials according to Japanese GCP standards. That normally requires getting a Japanese doctor involved early on when you're doing the protocol, et cetera, in the U.S. or Europe. But I think also, if you can provide some technical documents showing that the clinical trial was conducted according to Japanese GCP standards, and those technical documents are considered appropriate from overseas, then there's a decent chance you'll meet the Japanese GCP requirements. Okay, let's see. Some more questions here. The next question is, although the product groups for QMS inspection under the PAL revisions have not yet been released by the PMDA, could you give an example of a potential product group for QMS? So I think we talked about this during the presentation. Currently, the QMS inspections are done on a product-by-product basis, and in the future, the revisions will be doing the QMS on a product group basis. So let's see, you want an example. So let's say we have a situation where there might be 3 products that you could combine into one product group. So the product 1, let's say, is a cardiotomy venous reservoir, and then the product 2 is a heart-lung machine roller pump, and part 3 is, let's say, a cardiopulmonary bypass heat exchanger. So all 3 of these products are currently separate products that would require independent QMS inspections. However, with the new revisions, the PMDA could classify these products under one group in the cardiology area, and then do the QMS for the product grouping and not for the individual product. So another question we have here is, will biocompatibility testing be part of the safety and function testing to prove that the raw material change is equivalent? Will biocompatibility testing be part of the safety and function testing to prove that the raw material change is equivalent? I don't know the answer to that question, but obviously, if you have the biocompatibility testing, it's going to make it a lot easier. So I think that really comes down to a question of what the raw material change is and how significant that will affect the usage of the device. But I'm not sure there's any regulations out with respect to whether biocompatibility testing will be part of the safety and the function testing to prove that the raw material change is equivalent. I'm not sure there's any details on that yet. Okay, we have time for a few more questions. Let's see here. We're having issues with our current Japanese distributor. Do you have any recommendations on resolutions? We're having issues with our Japanese distributor. Do you have any recommendations or resolutions? Well, I don't know exactly what the problems are with the Japanese distributor, but, I think the thing in Japan is you really need to develop a personal relationship with the distributor, and you need to make sure you're on the same page with supporting them with samples, current information, etc. So I would be careful about firing your Japanese distributor too quickly. You might find as a U.S. manufacturer, European manufacturer, that if you decide to end a partnership with a Japanese distributor, you may get somewhat of a tarnished reputation in the country because things don't change so much in Japan. So, and also obviously if your reputation is sullied in Japan, other potential distributors in that country may hesitate to carry the manufacturer's products. So I would be very careful about firing your Japanese distributor in Japan. Try to work through the issues on your own. And again, when difficulties arise, you want to try to use personal solutions and face-to-face visits instead of emails or conference calls. Most business in Japan is best done face-to-face. Okay, we have a few more questions here. So a question is on reimbursement. How much extra time will it take to get your product reimbursed approved from B to C? So if your product is going to be reimbursed in B, how much additional time may it take to get the reimbursement code moved from B to C? So normally, this is a good example for companies. You have a product which has some new features, and the question is, should you put it in an existing category, like a category B, which is going to give you a little lower reimbursement, but you can get the product on the market sooner, or should you push for a little higher reimbursement, which will take more time to get and will delay getting the product on the market? And keep in mind that in Japan, it's very difficult to change the reimbursement once the product reimbursement code has been allocated. So it's not like you want to go for a category B reimbursement now, get the product on the market, and then later on think it's going to be easy to go to a C reimbursement category. So, I think to switch from a B to C oftentimes will require restarting the reimbursement process. It may take a number of months for the MHL to decide the category, if the category C is appropriate, and then they're going to have to follow the procedures for C registration. So you can expect if you're trying to go from a B to a C reimbursement, the time for reimbursement could go anywhere from, let's say, 5 to 12 months, the difference between the B and the C reimbursement classification. Let's see, next question. What areas does the PMDA focus on during the product registration? Do you have any tips for success? What areas does the PMDA focus on during the product registration? Do you have any tips for success? Well, as I mentioned in the presentation, the PMDA likes to have as much detail as possible, but also, you don't want to have too much information, which can lead to other issues down the road. So again, we talked about that if your product has any changes after the initial approval, you may have to do a partial change review, which require the PMDA and MHLW to be involved. But now they're having a more simplified changes can be more of a minor change notification as opposed to a partial change notification that can be done quicker. But I'd say in general, the data on things like biocompatibility, stability, performance are common areas that we find deficient in dossiers for product registration. So again, sometimes we find the data on the biocompatibility, stability, and performance being deficient on the dossier that's been sent in. And another area where we find problems is that if you're comparing your product to an existing device, you really need to give a lot of detail on how that comparison is and details on the product history or any adverse events that occurred in the marketplace. So let's see, I think we have time for one more question. I'm sorry that we can't get to all the questions today. There's about 100 we got in from the people in the audience. So let's see. Okay, next question is, how often does a company need to update its product's registration? How often does a company need to update its product registration in Japan? Well, the product registration, whether that's a Shonin, Ninsho, whatever, it doesn't have an expiration date once you get the approval. This is very different than in China, where the registration approvals are like 4 years, for example. But keep in mind, although there's no expiration date for the registration approval in Japan, the QMS and the MAH license expire every 5 years. So these licenses you'll need to go through the renewal process. So again, the product registrations don't expire in Japan, but every 5 years you need to go through the renewal process for the QMS and the MAH license. Next question, which would be the next question, is what role do professional societies play in the reimbursement process? What role do professional societies play in the reimbursement process? So I guess this is like professional associations, like they may have a association on cardiology association or whatever. I'd say in general that the professional societies are not that important in the reimbursement process, but certain key doctors would be more important. In some cases, however, let's say when an applicant's proposed reimbursement category is not accepted, a professional society may be able to provide some assistance, but it's really sort of difficult to tell. And so in general, I'd say that the key opinion leaders, the KOLs, are more influential in the reimbursement process than professional societies. Okay, let's see here. I think we have time for one more question. The question says, once the PA revisions, okay, that we did that. When submitting a device approval, okay. Okay, well, I think that's going to conclude the presentation in the Q&A period. Again, my name is Ames Gross, Pacific Bridge Medical. We will be sending out an evaluation form. We'd appreciate you filling out the evaluation, giving us some feedback on today's webcast presentation. And we are going to have a webcast on China next month, and we look forward to your attendance and participation then. So thanks again. Have a nice day, and goodbye. Thank you. The webcast is now over.